Hi everyone, wanted to do this PowerPoint as a way to kick off our unit on discrimination. Before spring break, we'll be talking about the role that women played in American history and some of the ways the treatment of women in American society has changed over time. And then after spring break, we'll be talking about other groups of people in American history, different races, different religions, and how they've been treated, and how that treatment has changed and why. A couple of things to say before we get started. Women make up more than half the population. It is very difficult to generalize about the role of role of women in American society, um, just because there's so much diversity within women and the way they are treated. Um, Obviously, in order to study this as a topic, you have to do some generalization, which is always difficult. It'll be very easy to always find an example of a particular woman who doesn't fit the norm, doesn't fit the stereotype. So when we're talking in this PowerPoint about the way women were treated, we're obviously talking about sort of the majority, the general feelings of society towards women. But there are always examples that prove the rule with this kind of a topic, just given the huge number of people that we're discussing in this presentation. It's when you're thinking about what makes up a person's identity and the way that they're treated by society, it's important to remember that it's not just a person's gender that is part of that, but it's also their race, their class, their education, where they live, their religion. All of these many factors combine to make up the way society views you and the way that you would have been treated in society. So if you look at just as like a little critical thinking activity, I created these three fictitious women. An Irish woman living in America in 1852, a black woman living in Virginia in 1827, and the wife of the Ohio governor in 1855. And the question I'd ask you is, which of those women would be the most powerful? This might be a good moment to pause the video and think on that for a second. Which of those three women is the most powerful in their time period? Obviously, there's no right answer to this because, again, other factors might determine it, but I think you could make a good case that the Irish woman is the most powerful. Although I bet a lot of you thought that the wife of the Ohio governor was. Obviously, the black woman in Virginia in 1827 would have been enslaved, which would have severely limited her power. But I think you can make a case that the Irish woman was more powerful than the wife of the Ohio governor, because the wife of the Ohio governor would have certain norms that she would have to live up to because of her husband's position of prominence and the way people would look at him. Meaning, she highly, highly unlikely would not have had a job. Whereas the Irish woman probably was working outside the home in order to support her family. Maybe that meant she wasn't as wealthy, wasn't as comfortable, but she definitely had more control over the outcome of her own life and more independence, for lack of a better word. I don't know that independence necessarily equals power, but in the way I'm looking at this question, I think it is. And I think these kinds of activities are useful because it helps us think about, well, where in society, what were the norms in society, who was held to those norms, and who was not. And with gender, these are particularly important issues for us to be thinking about and discussing. Okay, in America, and really anywhere in the European world too, but particularly in the United States, in the 1800s there were ideal gender roles. I put ideal in quotes because obviously these aren't the ideals that we hold today, but at the time this was the way that they viewed the world. And they thought that the best way to divide the world was into two spheres, a public sphere and a private sphere. And that women would be in charge of the private sphere and that men would be in charge of the public sphere. This was their division in society. And it's important to note that sometimes we think that men were just discriminating against women when they were not allowing them to get jobs outside the home or discouraging them from going outside the home and being involved in society. And obviously that's true, but I think it's not so much that men were intentionally trying to harm women. It was that they thought they were giving women their own very important jobs in running the private sphere. Obviously, this limited the freedom of women significantly, which is why we see problems with that today. But it's not that they thought women couldn't do anything. It's just that they thought women were really good at doing the private sphere jobs, which we'll talk about in a second. And I would note, although this is sort of an unusual way to look at it, that a man who wanted to do the private sphere jobs would be just as ridiculed in the 1800s as a woman who tried to do the public sphere jobs. The public sphere was the combination of jobs and tasks in a family that involved interacting with society and doing work outside the home. Obviously, this included employment, but it also included things like voting, interacting with the legal system, public speaking, sports is something that we don't often think about, but is definitely true. And again, their belief was that men were sort of biologically and uniquely suited to do these jobs better than women. We don't agree with that today, but at the time that was the way that they viewed society. Whereas women were seen as much better at doing the private sphere jobs. These are not unimportant jobs, I just want to point out. These are really important jobs, and men writing at the time thought that they were giving women these very important jobs, including maintaining the home, teaching the children, because public schools are not common until much later in the 1800s, providing the food, which often included, gardening, possibly trading, and cleaning the home. Those were incredibly difficult and time-consuming jobs in a pre-industrial period where you don't have any machines like vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and washing machines. And their idea was that women were just better suited to do these. Again, the limits in this time period limited both men and women. It's just that the limits on women were much more visible because those jobs today are jobs that, when we're taking a government or history class, we talk a lot about. Obviously, this system had tons of exceptions to it. Even though those were the ideal gender roles, there were lots of people who were trying to live up to that ideal, but never were quite able to. You see this picture on the left of these women out on the frontier. Where there weren't enough men to do all of the public sphere jobs, women had to take on those responsibilities. It's not a coincidence that the first state that gives women the right to vote is Wyoming in 1869. It's because there aren't enough men to run the government and have a vibrant debate in Wyoming because the population is so low. So they give women a role and the right to vote as a way to get them involved in the public sphere because there just aren't enough men. The other huge exception to this system are families where they're too poor to have this. If you were a middle class or upper class family in the middle 1800s, the wife would not have worked and would have done the things in the private sphere as a way to conform to what society expected. But for most poor families, including obviously anyone enslaved, but all immigrant families too, the whole family might have had to work. The men couldn't provide alone with their income for the whole family, and that was oftentimes seen as a disgraceful thing for the man, that he could not make enough money to provide for his family, and thus his wife and children had to go out into the private sphere. So there were many exceptions to this, but this was the system that everybody was trying to live up to, and it's a system that starts to break down in the 1900s, as we'll see. Industrial Revolution happens around the time of the Civil War, and you see women more and more going into the public sphere to take jobs, but they're taking jobs doing things that used to be in the private sphere. So for example, in a world before the Industrial Revolution, women used to make clothing at home. Now that clothing's being made in factories using looms, women take on those positions because those are tasks they used to do in the public sphere, in the private sphere. Same thing with schooling. Women used to teach the children in the home, especially the young children. When public schools become more common, women begin to go and take on those jobs because they used to teach the kids at home, and now they teach the children in the public sphere. These sorts of stereotyped gender roles around professions Even in 2015, they're still present. Okay, next time you go and you um, go to a restaurant, take a look in the kitchen and look at the people who are cooking the food. You'll find that in most restaurants, a huge percentage are men, um, because they're getting paid to do the cooking. That's unusual, given that a lot of times we consider cooking to be quote unquote women's work, and definitely in this time period it was seen that way. Um, if you think about the elementary school you went to, HB or otherwise, think about the number of men who worked in that school. Think about the number of men who work in the middle school you work at now. Think about the number of men who work in the high school you work at. Even at a girls' school like HB, we have approximately half of the faculty members at HB that are men. And then if you think about the college you're going to go to, you'll have a higher percentage there that are men. We still have this idea that elementary age children are better taught by women, and men are resistant to going into that profession, because of stereotypes or whatever the case may be. See if you can think of other ways that people constrain themselves with these gender ideals in different professions in society, most of which are held over from this time period. Okay, it's not so much that, again, men saw these roles, this division of public sphere and private sphere, as women getting less important work or women not being able to do anything, but it was more that they felt threatened by women who challenged this system, mostly because they thought then they would be the ones who would have to go into the private sphere. And this is an incredibly threatening thing to men, and it seems really weird to us today, hard for us to relate to, but I can show you political cartoon after political cartoon that illustrates this. Men thought that it was being in the public sphere that made them masculine, and that if they had to go and do the work at home, that they would no longer be men. They thought this was a total threat to the way democracy and order worked, so when women ask for the right to vote, men think it's totally turning their society upside down, and it causes quite a bit of anxiety, fear, paranoia, and that explains some of their behavior as to why men resisted women going into the public sphere for so long. We'll be talking more about this during class and looking at some historical examples. So let me know if you have any questions when we begin class on Thursday. Thanks.